leaving on time. And I regret that not everyone was on time for this, but hopefully we'll have a few more log in. Just got one already. And it's great to see you all. It's been a very action-packed week, and it's always wonderful to be back in our virtual Beit Midrash, broadcasting from the Shokin Library in Jerusalem. We're having a very, very special open house program in Jerusalem tomorrow. A number of very special homes are going to be opened to visitors. And in addition, the Shokin Institute is on the list of special sites for that. So we're ready to go for tomorrow. And in terms of some housekeeping, I want to mention that on December 1st, which is the 4th day of Hanukkah, JTS is going to be hosting a learning marathon, much like we did last Hanukkah. And I'm going to be presenting the first lecture on that day, in which I'm going to discuss the image of the Maccabees in modern Israeli identity through art and literature. So you're welcome to join that, log in for an action-packed 30-minute class. And enjoy. So I wanted to be sure that that's on your radar screen. And just a quick update from our students in Israel. We had 20 rabbinical students at the Shokin Institute today. And we were discussing the topic of cultural Zionism, Achad Ha'am, Martin Buber. In addition, the early Yeshuv years, the years of early settlement just prior to the rise of the state. We had a very, very animated conversation about a very, very interesting exchange that Gandhi had with Buber. If you haven't seen that, I am happy to put Gandhi's letter into Ronnie's hands and she can send it out to all of you. Gandhi was asked to respond to the question of what he thinks about a Jewish state in Palestine. This was in September 1938. And he wrote a very, very unfortunate responsum on what it is that he believed. And Martin Buber responded in a very, very forceful, beautiful and poetic way to Gandhi's words. So we had a very, very interesting conversation about that with my students. And then we walked 10 minutes from the Shokin Institute down to the buildings of the Jewish Agency on King George Street. I'm sure many of you have been there. And we had a presentation by Yitzhar Hess, who now represents the Masorti movement in the World Zionist Organization. He was the head of the Masorti movement for 13 years. So we were talking about a number of hot button issues, including gauging his optimism on whether or not this government is going to implement the Kotel Agreement. So plenty of interesting things came out of that. And the best news is that the country is opening the gates, opening its doors, and we're seeing more than a trickle of tourists already coming into the country, which has been wonderful. We feel that life is returning to this place. So hopefully we'll get you all here as soon as possible. With that, let's jump into this week's Parashat Vayishlakh. And the topic that I want to discuss is the ethics of power in Jewish tradition, or more specifically, the Jewish attitude toward power, strength, and force. And it's actually a wonderful topic to be discussing in the lead up to Hanukkah, right? When we talk about the story of the Maccabees from 166 BCE. Right? And we have the story of Judah Maccabee, who rises up against the Seleucid king, that is Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who desecrates the temple, not only desecrates the temple, but suppresses the practice of Judaism in the land of Israel. And of course, the Maccabees rise up successfully against the oppressive rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. And part of what's so interesting and what you're going to hear me talk about on the fourth day of Hanukkah, if you tune in, is this notion of the Maccabees as a symbol of heroism, right? And the place of strength, force, how it is that Zionism appropriated the image of the Maccabee as the hero that we should emulate as we return to our homeland in the land of Israel. So this topic of the ethics of power is a very, very relevant topic in the lead up to Hanukkah. And in so many ways, the notion in which, or framework in which it is that we think about the Maccabees is something that runs very much counter to how it is that we relate to power and strength in Jewish tradition. And you're going to see that play out in this particular study. If anything, it is the case, as Martin Buber points out in quoting the prophet Zechariah, lo b'chayil v'lo b'choach ki im beruchi. Right? It's not through might, it's not through strength, but rather, right, as the prophet Zechariah teaches us, right, it's through God's Spirit, right, that we achieve redemption. And we're going to feel that tension play out as we take a look at the sources related to Parashat Vayishlakh. So let's place us in the setting of Parashat Vayishlakh. Right, Vayishlakh is famous for the encounter between Jacob and Esau. And remember that 20 years earlier, Jacob is heading back to the land of Israel. 20 years earlier, Esau makes a horrific threat against his brother Jacob. And that's what propels Jacob to go back to the old country to seek a wife for himself. I'm going to pull up the source sheet so we have it in front of us. Okay, you should all see it clearly on your screen. Right, we're going back to 20 years before in Genesis 27. And there we read, now Esau harbored a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing which his father had given him. And Esau said to himself, let but the mourning period of my father come, and I will kill my brother Jacob. When the words of her older son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill you. And it's at that point that Rivkah prevails on her beloved son Jacob to run off, go to the old country and find yourself a wife, right? Which he does quite prolifically, ends up not only with one wife, but with two wives, and eventually makes his way back to the land of Israel. Of course, as he's making his way back to the land of Israel, right, we have the following source in Genesis chapter 32. Right, the messengers returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau. He himself is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. Jacob was greatly frightened. In his anxiety, he divided the people with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps. What follows on the heels of this is the very, very famous wrestling episode that Jacob has in the middle of the night. You'll recall that last year, that was the episode that we went into depth on, trying to identify the zahut, the identity of the mysterious assailant that Jacob wrestles with. Right? And remember, we had a number of possibilities, but this is what sparks that wrestling episode. For our purposes now, what we find intriguing as we look at these particular verses is look at the middle line that you see on your screen in the Hebrew, Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo, where it says Jacob was greatly frightened, right? And he was troubled. Right? That's a better translation than what you see here in his anxiety. The question is, why do we have this doubling of languages? Why does it say Vayira Yaakov me'od and also Vayetzer lo? Right? Torah seems to want to communicate two messages to us. There's a certain economy of language that we have all throughout Torah. So when we have a doubling of expressions that at first glance seems to be synonymous, At first glance, it seems to be communicating exactly the same notion. Vayira Yaakov ma'od. Yaakov was greatly anxious, or he trembled. Vayetzer lo, and he was troubled. Right? So what two meanings could this possibly be communicating to us? Generally, biblical text uses words efficiently, so it's got to be communicating at least two messages. Of course, we turn to the prolific commentator Rashi and take a look at what Rashi says about this particular verse. He feared greatly and was distressed. Rashi writes, he was afraid lest he be killed, and he was distressed that he might have to kill someone. Right? In other words, Jacob feared that he might be killed by Esav, and he was also fearful lest Esav be coming to kill him. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai in Genesis Rabbah, a collection of midrashim on the book of Genesis, right, states the following in the Hebrew. Devar acher, vayira Yaakov ma'od vayetzer lo. So we have a quote of this challenging excerpt from the verse that we're looking at. And we're told, Amar Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eli. Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Eli, teaches, Lohi yira lohi tzara, that there's got to be a difference between fear and the trembling that he's facing. Ele vayira shelo yeharog, vayetzer lo shelo yehareg. And here he's essentially sharing the same notion that Rashi shares with us, that essentially he's fearful that either he's going to kill or be killed. Amar, Jacob said, Im hu mitkaber alai horgeni. If he rises up against me and triumphs, he's going to kill me. Ve'im ani mitkaber alav, but if I rise up against him, ani horgo, then I am going to kill him. Right? This is the great fear that Jacob is sensing in this particular moment. Okay, curious to hear your responses and to see if you have any alternative explanations to what it is that we're seeing in Rashi's commentary.
I thought about this just now, and I brought it back earlier to an earlier thing. I thought, yes, he was afraid of getting killed, but also in the background of his mind, he's saying, I did something so terribly wrong initially. And now maybe he's also thinking, if I do get killed, I'll have to appear before God with this terrible thing that I did in front of him, and will be judged. I thought that there was something more, not just, I hadn't thought about the thing about his being killed or having to kill another. I was back in time.
Excellent, Naomi. I love how you enriched our understanding of the possibilities here and expanded our understanding of the possibilities. That perhaps in Jacob's mind, he's going back to the wrong that he committed, right? And that's why he's trembling in this moment, right? The way you stated it, it's, fear that if something happens to him and he faces God and he has to give an account of his actions, right? But also, right, it's perhaps this overwhelming shame of now confronting his brother Esav with everything that he did to Esav from way back. Excellent. Joel?
Yeah, putting this into a different context, we now see this quite a bit. This is what's called the second part. He's afraid that he might kill someone. This is now what's being called moral distress. We see this a lot in Vietnam era vets, because that was the only conflict where people were conscripted and forced to fight, and they were forced to do things which, in retrospect, like Naomi said, was morally repugnant to them, and they struggle with this. and especially, doing hospice work, now as they get to the end of their lives, they have been able to tamp this all down. And then once they get into the situation where they really are facing the end, it's, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, what did I do? What did I do? Am I going to be punished? So I think that there's an aspect of moral distress to, to this situation and to what Jacob is feeling.
Excellent, excellent. Right. And we're certainly, feeling that in the power of this moment. So it's not only a fear of physically killing or being killed, right? But maybe, Joel, that's an even more profound and and deeper fear that he has here. It's the moral distress, everything that is coming to the fore again from when he was back in his parents' home, right? At least over 20 years, he had distance from it, and now he's going to be thrown back into those very, very painful memories. Steve?
I think the last shir that we did together, we talked about how the Bible was so future looking that it had disruption is a common thing now, but they already had it back then. And I think very much like Joel was saying, I think that we have PTSD now, that we see that not only in Vietnam, but even in Iraq, when people are not conscripted, when they go on their own, that even when you're a victor in battle, you still suffer a lot of damage and pain. I think it was very future looking that he understood that.
You're actually reminding me, Steve, of a very, very important book that came out just after the 6-Day War. It was called The Seventh Day, right? Of course, 6-Day War, major celebrations all over Israel, all over the Jewish world. And what people were ignoring was the trauma that our soldiers went through, those who fought, right? And as you're pointing out, even in victory, you have PTSD. And certainly, within our patriarchal and matriarchal traditions, there's plenty of PTSD to go around. So it's no wonder that, Jacob would be shaking in his boots at precisely at this moment. Any other comments before we jump back into the text? Phyllis?
Maybe there's a lot of guilt, like I had already done him very badly, and maybe I deserve this, and how can I go and fight, and it's brother against brother, and but sort of I can't kill him after I have already caused him to be the way he is. There's guilt going on here too, I think.
Right,
when
certainly.
this all comes back up.
Right, there's plenty of guilt in this relationship. It's one of the reasons that Jacob decides to send these malachim, these messengers, who are going to deliver gifts to Esav, right? Ultimately, Esav refuses the gifts and says, no worries, but one feels the power of the guilt, the anxiety, the PTSD in this moment. And that's all folded within this particular experience. Larry?
Yeah, to go back to the original question, regardless of what he's feeling troubled by, the original talks about being fearful and troubled. They're really not the same. I mean, you initially sort of said, well, why does the Bible or why does the Torah repeat itself? And it's really not a repeat. They're two separate things. Fear and trouble, regardless of what you're troubled about, however we interpret this, they're really two separate things, and that's why they're two different phrases.
I accept it. It's yes. Vayera Yaakov Ma'od, right? We could say, right, that he was very fearful, right? Vayetzer lo, right? And he was troubled. He was troubled, right? There was this, it's interesting. One could, if we look at it, the root there, quite literally, tsar, there was this narrowness going on inside, or a narrowing that was going on inside of him, that was, creating anxiety, great anxiety. So I accept the critique here that maybe, we have two different expressions pointing to two different possibilities. But at first glance, there's this sense that they're conveying the same notion of being troubled. But yes, there's a nuance difference. Shelley?
I have a question about the word Yair versus Pachad. Is one more Torah used?
Vayetzer, not Yair, Vayetzer, right?
No, the word for fear.
Okay, fear, yes. Vayira.
What is the difference between that and Pachad? And is Pachad not used in the Torah, like to be afraid?
No, Pachad is also used in Torah.
Is there
No,
a
they're very
difference?
similar. They're very similar terms, and they're often, exchangeable. Okay. But what's interesting too, as you're talking about, yira can be fear and yira can be awe. And, depending on the context in which it's being used, you sort of have to, feel your way through exactly what it is that's being referred to. But, it's also the sense that yira and pachad are also interchangeable with each other. So let's jump back into the text. Okay, I want to take you now to another episode in which we're dealing with power and strength that makes Jacob feel quite uncomfortable, right? And that is in the context of the rape of Dinah. Okay, let me pull this up, right? In Genesis chapter 34. Okay, remember, after Dinah's rape, Shimon and Levi respond very, very forcefully to what it is that plays out in Shechem. And remember what they end up doing is they compel the male Shechemites, as it were, to circumcise themselves. And then as they're recovering, they slaughter all of the men. Okay, Jacob seems to be quite passive in this episode and doesn't respond in the same, it doesn't respond as vengefully as his sons respond. And Jacob says to Shimon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My men are few in number, so that if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed. But they answered appropriately, right? Should our sister be treated like a whore, right? And we just, sit here passively. But part of what this is showing you is that Jacob has this fear not only of killing, but also an aversion to violence and to weapons, even in this particular situation where you think he would respond in sort of a very knee-jerk and vengeful way. He's very, very disturbed by the behavior of Shimon and Levi, right? And look at what it is that Jacob says ultimately when the sons are given blessings later on in Genesis chapter 49. Look at what it is that he says about Shimon and Levi. Shimon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their counsel. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when angry, they slay men, and when pleased, they maim oxen. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. Right? And Genesis Rabbah picks up on this. Right? And right at the beginning, Shimon v'Levi achim, right? Shimon and Levi are a pair, they're brothers. And it goes on to say, achim leDinah velo leYosef, right? They are brothers to Dinah, right? But not brothers to Joseph. What do we mean by that? Klei Hamas mechorotehem, right? Weapons of violence, right, are their tools, right? That is what they are about. Amar lahem hakelim halalu So Jacob says to Shimon and Levi that these instruments that are in your hands, shebeyedchem, gizulim hem beyedchem, right? They are weapons of violence. They are stolen weapons that are in your hands. Lemi hem re'uyim, right? To whom are they appropriate? Le'esav shemachar et bechora. They are appropriate only to Esav and not, right, to, right, the people of Jacob, right? They're appropriate to Esav, who spurned his birthright, right? But they are not fitting to the descendants of Jacob, right? It's making a clear distinction between the line of Jacob and the line of Esav, right? Esav, right, is perceived to be this person of violence, right? But Jacob, right, violence, strength, sheer power, this is not befitting of his line of people, right? What the Midrash is doing is it's creating this very severe distinction between the two brothers, right? It's wanting to say that Jacob is the chosen line and Jacob's path is one of pursuit of peace, right? And eschewing weaponry. Esav, on the other hand, is about brute strength. Questions or comments that you have before we turn to the Mishnah of Brachot? Shelley.
I just want to give a plug for our Torah Minute this week because Arvin did it and he commented on this parsha, of course. So I will forward it. Arvin, I know, is going to give me permission to forward it to you.
Fantastic. Okay, we will make sure the whole group gets to hear from Reb Arvin, Lichvod HaParsha.
Hi.
Diane.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm late because we're not at home. So I almost forgot.
It's quite all right. We're
story,
thrilled we have you.
the story always disturbed me because I don't think the brothers knew the true story of Dina and the young man that she fell in love with and vice versa. And I think if I recall the story, they were really looking to be a part of her people, or at least to have some sort of relationship, and that to just go and slaughter people when they're at their weakest, that's not my kind of doing something. And this story always disturbed me. And I had very, very little respect for, you know, the brothers. They didn't even talk to their father. They never got anything. They never tried to seek out the sister to see what actually happened. And I never cared for the boys. I mean, that is my opinion.
It's a generous reading that you have of the rape of Dinah. But remember, right, that at the very, very beginning of this episode, it says, Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, chief of the country, saw her and took her and lay with her by force. Right. Right. So it's very, very disturbing. Yes, it's incredibly disturbing how Shimon and Levi sort of, take justice into their own hands and do what they do. But on the other hand, it's quite upsetting that, Jacob seems to be so passive in all of this. If indeed, his daughter is raped here, which it seems from the pshat that she is, why doesn't he respond in a more forceful way? Why doesn't, he, take vengeance here? And he seems to be shying away from confrontation. I'm
sorry, go ahead.
So I don't know what's worse, Diane.
But why didn't he just go after the guy who supposedly raped the sister? Why did they have to go and go to that? That is what truly bothers me.
Right. Well, look, I think part of what happens here is because it becomes an episode not simply between two individuals, right, but between, essentially two nations, right? It's not only Shechem who's, trying to negotiate here. It's his father Hamor that gets involved in negotiations, right? And Hamor is trying to remember, he says, "My son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters for yourselves. You will dwell among us, and the land will be open before you." But remember, there's a power dynamic that's going on here, right? The Shechemites are far more powerful than Jacob and his family, right? Jacob and his family, they're truly strangers in this strange land. They're minorities, and they're living under threat. And even though Hamor makes it sound like a very generous offer, it's not. He's not giving them much choice. But in the same breath, I'll say, you're right. Maybe Shimon and Levi should have just taken vengeance against Shechem and Hamor, and not collective punishment.
I think
Right.
there's another power dynamic here. And I think that's a dynamic between Jacob and those two sons, the two older sons, and Shimon and the other one. And I think he's trying to assert his superiority or his control of the situation. And on the other hand, I think that underlying all of this, he may have said, "Oh, so what's one gets a daughter, and forget it. This isn't important in the big structure of things in which, yes, Shechem is bigger and more powerful than we are." So I think that there are a couple of power dynamics going in here, and also as the times were, women were nothing at that time. Of course, the family honor is something, but he put that into perspective. It was his perspective that he was a smaller nation.
Well said, Naomi. Okay, I want to take you back into the source sheet, and we're going to turn to Mishnah Shabbat, right, as we look at how it is that the rabbinic tradition relates, right, to weaponry. Okay, this is very, very interesting. This is in the context of carrying outside of the Eruv on Shabbat. Okay, and look at what it says here. Just as it is prohibited for a woman to carry out certain items unique to a woman into the public domain, right? The sages said that a man may neither go out on Shabbat with a sword, nor with a bow, nor with a shield, nor with an Allah, nor with a spear. And if he unwittingly went out with one of these weapons to the public domain, he is liable to bring a sin offering. Okay, now hold on. Rabbi Eliezer says these weapons are ornaments for him. Just as a man is permitted to go out into the public domain with other ornaments, he is permitted to go out with weapons. To which the rabbis respond. Look at how forcefully the rabbis respond to Rabbi Eliezer. They say they are nothing other than reprehensible, and in the future they will be eliminated. As it is written, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not raise sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. Okay, lest you think that a man could go walk out, right, with weapons, right, and we simply call them ornaments. What the Mishnah is coming to say is that Shabbat is a taste of Olam Haba, right? It's a taste of life thereafter, right? A taste of paradise, as it were. And what the rabbis are saying very, very forcefully is that there is no place for weaponry, right, in that vision of Shabbat or that vision of the prophets, right, that messianic era, right? And they're saying this very, very clearly, right? But in the same breath, lest you think we come from only a pacifist tradition, right? It teaches us in Talmud Brachot, very, very important teaching, 58a, right? The Torah makes clear that if somebody is coming to kill you, if one comes to kill him first, right? Very, very critical teaching, right? So in other words, right, if Esav were running to kill Jacob, right, which we don't see him do, right? But if Esav were actually coming with a sword to kill his brother, right, then Jacob would have every right, right, to kill his brother first, right? It's this delicate dance that's going on within rabbinic tradition, where rabbinic tradition is expressing this aversion to brute power and to weaponry on the one hand, but on the other, right, it's not simply a case of, if somebody is coming to kill you, you don't just, right, roll over, and play dead, right? That, right, you have, it's not only a right, it's a mitzvah to defend yourself, right? And rabbinic tradition is saying that very, very clearly. The question is, how do we achieve balance in all of this, right? We don't want to go to, one extreme or the other, right? The extreme of Esav or the extreme of Jacob. And not only that, I want to point out that when you look at the pshat of the text that appears in this week's Pasha, it's not at all the case that Esav is coming with force. I mean, the only hint that we have of force is that, he is with his community of 400 men. Okay? Yes, that's suggestive. But when the encounter actually happens, what does Esav do? Not just a rhetorical question. How does Esav respond to his brother Jacob?
Acceptance with love.
Steve, say it again. You cut out a bit.
It's acceptance. With love, he says, let's get together.
It's not only acceptance, he embraces his brother and kisses him on the neck. Okay, but of course, rabbinic tradition tells us that he bit him on the neck, right? That Esav bit his brother, right? It's this demonizing of, but meanwhile, it's this very, very touching moment of, the brothers reuniting after 20 years. And it seems that Esav is putting the hatred behind him. Steve, you wanted to say something else?
It's just unclear to me. I think it's unclear from the text whether Esav came with that in his mind or whether the gifts that were sent ahead of time by his brother, made him overcome and change his mind.
Right. Look, I'm willing to leave it open as a question in our minds. Right. What was it that, he sees his brother giving him gifts and he has a change of heart, or, it could be that it just simply was, maybe it was just simply a display of his strength that he wanted his brother to see. That, even though he loses the birthright, he loses the blessing, still he waxes very, very strong. He ends up being blessed, and he wants his brother to see that.
He buried the hatchet.
Larry, I see you shaking your head. What's the wisdom from Jacksonville?
Well, no, it's interesting. He, as you said, he comes with 400 men. I come here in peace with my 400 men. It's an interesting dynamic. There's a power dynamic here too. You took my birthright, and I've done okay, and so he's showing that. But he wanted to engender some fear. I'm still Esav. I'm still the hairy one that's the hunter, and I've got 400 men. And so there's a power dynamic here. And it's interesting in terms of our discussion last week, exactly who was supposed to get the blessing. We talked about that the last time, in terms of there being some question in terms of how the verse was written. So maybe in his mind, he still thinks I should have gotten this blessing, but let's let bygones be bygones. I've got 400 men. What do you have to say about that?
There you go. Thank you, Larry. Shelley.
I don't know. I'm not buying that. I don't buy that. We never hear from his voice. It's like all these stories. We don't hear from Dinah. We don't hear from Esav. We don't hear from these people. And we can only extrapolate the feelings of Jacob onto him, and that they were both equally afraid, equally unsure of what they were meeting. And in my mind, it was him that was the one that was wronged, him that was, the birthright was stolen. And it was for him to forgive. And Jacob, I have to say, he seems like a coward. He seems like a coward in both stories, in that he cowardly stole this birthright. He was cowardly with Dinah. And I just don't buy. I mean, we all have our own family issues. And I hate to.
Really? You think so,
Yeah.
Shelley?
I mean, you want peace within a family. And Asaph is the one that ultimately gave the peace. Jacob we all know he was wrestling. He didn't know what was going to happen. All he was really truly filled with, there was no thought in his mind that he seemed to want to make it right. He just wanted to get out of it alive, this encounter. So I just don't buy any of it. I don't buy turning Asaph into a, I wonder, we name our children Levi, we name our children Jacob. And then now I'm sitting here thinking.
Shimon.
And with a daughter who's pregnant, I'm thinking to myself, we have to really think through this name, because, what are we naming these kids after? Who are we naming these kids after? That's just my thought.
Okay, so
Shelley,
one thing that, a couple of things that I want to say. First of all, Shelley, you're reminding me of the wrestling that we went through when Adir was born, because we wanted to name Adir after my paternal grandfather. But my paternal grandfather's Hebrew name, right? In English, he was Paul, okay? And we certainly weren't going to name him Paul, even though I'm Matthew. So his Hebrew name was Pinchas. And we didn't know what to do with that, because we all know the violent, fanatical character that Pinchas is, and we didn't want to give Adir that legacy of violence. So we ended up naming Adir Pinchas, right? We figured, okay, we'll tuck it away as his middle name. And, that was the resolution. So I love what you're saying about that. And it speaks to the teaching, Kishmo Kenhu, just as one's name, so too is one's essence. Naming is a powerful thing. And maybe that's something that, we need to think about or, rethink as we go forward. The only thing that I want to correct in what you said is we actually do hear Esaph's voice in this particular episode. And when Jacob wants to bestow all of these gifts upon him, Esaph's response, graciously, he says, "I have enough, my brother. Let what you have remain yours." And then Jacob insists, "No, I pray you, if you would do me this favor, accept this gift. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, and you have received me favorably. Please accept this gift." Asaph says, "I have plenty. I don't need more." And then Asaph goes on to say, "Let us start our journey, and I will proceed at your pace." Okay, and Jacob ultimately refuses to journey with him. So I think Asaph appears as this very, very gracious, generous soul at this point, right? He's overcome, the bitterness, the hatred. And I think what we need to do this time of year is we need to help redeem the character and person of Asaph. He's not so terrible. Even though the rabbis vilify him, he's really, quite a hero in this story. Joel.
Yeah, okay, unmuted. I agree with, really with what Shelley was saying. Jacob really comes across as a wuss. And he always seems to have been a wuss. He really comes across as someone without really very much of his own agency. He did exactly what his mommy told him to do the whole time through. He just sits there and allows events to, shape him, and, the winds of whatever's going on blow him in one direction and the other. And, if you really look at it, he wasn't really very much of a father as well. He's making the distinction between Shimon and Levi and Yosef. Well, that's because Shimon and Levi were the sons of Leah, that he really didn't like. And Yosef was, Yosef and Binyamin were his two beloved children, and, he lived and died for them. And Leah's children, yeah, well, you're here, but, okay, whatever. Yes, he is one of the forefathers, but I don't think he is at the top of the list. It's like when you go Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I think there's a reason why Jacob is at the bottom of the list.
So Joel, that's a perfect segue to help us leap forward, right, to the modern state of Israel, okay? And I want to show you some of the wrestling that went on, in the years leading up to the state regarding, right, the role of strength and power with regard to, a sovereign state of Israel. So I want to show you 3 rabbinic opinions here. Okay, and the first is, ironically enough, Rabbi Jacob Reines. Okay, so we'll start with Yaakov. Okay, and what it is that Rabbi Jacob Reines says is the world of the book stands in opposition to the world of the sword. At the end of time, the entire world will turn into a Beit Midrash filled with Torah and wisdom. In other words, he felt that a Jewish army is sort of a contradiction in terms. Right? He was very deeply concerned. Remember, you see that he doesn't live to see the founding of the state of Israel. Right? He dies in 1915, but he's part of the whole Zionist conversation. Right? And he wants to see a very, very different kind of state arise, one that has as its core the world of the book standing in opposition to the world of the sword. Now look at what Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook writes in an essay entitled Hamilchama, the War. He's the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Palestine. Dates are 1865 to 1935. Okay, and here's what he writes, right? He recognizes that the world is imperfect. And although in theory he would agree with Rabbi Reines, okay, here's what he has to say. Violence is antithetical to Judaism. Exile was forced on the Jewish people because they did not want to exercise power until a time in which the government of the world could unfold, or let's say the governance of the world could unfold without violence. It is not befitting of Jacob to engage in political life when statehood demands violence and a talent for evil. Okay, remember too that Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook does not live to see the founding of the state, right? But at the same time, he's recognizing that the world is imperfect. Nonetheless, moving forward, look at what it is that hold on, the document just jumped. Let me reopen it. Look at what his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, where did it go? Here we are. Look at what his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook says. Okay, Tzvi Yehuda Kook is essentially the one who gives vision and voice to the beginning of the settler movement, okay, post-1967. And this is a very, very powerful excerpt that I'm going to translate for you now. Here's what he writes. V'yeshno kodesh shel hamitzvot asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav vetzivanu. Right, that there is a sense of holiness in all of God's commandments. And we say, right, that God sanctified us in his commandments. Now let's unpack what Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook says. V'hakodesh shel hamitzvah haklal Yisraelit shel hamlachat melech b'Yisrael. And there is holiness in the appointment of a king or a kingship over Israel. Umitoch kach el medinat Yisrael. And in the same way of governance, there is holiness in the establishment of the state of Israel. v'sidor shilton shel Yisrael, and in the organization of power exercised by a state of Israel. Zohi mitzvah v'zohi kiddusha. This is a commandment, and this is also holiness. So what is Tzvi Yehuda Kook doing? He's ascribing holiness to the secular governance of the state of Israel. And he goes on to say the following, Umitoch kach, and from this, kol ma sheshayach lekiyum mitzvot hazot, that everything related to the fulfillment of this commandment to establish a system of governance over the Jewish people, kodem kol kiddushat hatzava, right? It relates to the holiness of the army. Kol hatankim, kol hamachshirim sheshayachim lezeh, all of the tanks, right, that are part of the Israeli army, and every piece of weaponry that is connected to this, arukim v'ktsarim v'agulim, right, that which is long, that which is short, that which is round. Ineni baki b'shemot, I am not an expert on the terms related to the weaponry that the Israeli army uses, but he goes on to say here, bein shemi totzeret shelanu or bein shemi totzeret shel hagoyim, whether it's produced by the state of Israel or produced by the nations of the world, kol zeh shayach lekidusha hazot. Everything is endowed with a sense of holiness, right? He's saying in a very, very dramatic way that the army is holy and that the weaponry that the IDF uses is holy. Okay, he's not mincing his words. He's glorifying brute strength here. He's taking, quite a sharp turn from the philosophy of his father, right? His father who says, right, that violence should not be the way of Jacob. And what the son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, is doing is he's sanctifying weaponry here, okay? All of that to say that we need a balance between these two perspectives, right? And Joel was touching on this very, very beautifully when Joel pointed out to us, right, that Yaakov in many ways is a wuss, right? Jacob comes off as a very, very weak character. But remember, Joel, that Jacob is also named Yisrael. He is also given the name of Israel after the wrestling episode, right? This is the struggle that the individual character Jacob goes through. And it ends up being the struggle that we as a nation go through all throughout history. When is it that we act like Jacob, and when is it that we act like Israel? How do we find, the correct balance, right? And certainly, you're reminding me too of how it is that Zionism wanted to create a new image of the Jew, right? What did Zionism eschew? Zionism didn't like that the Jews of the diaspora were very, very passive, right? We let the nations do whatever they wanted to us, right? To the point where we were persecuted, where we were oppressed, we end up in the Pale of Settlement, things get worse, right? We're the victims of pogroms, right? And there's this sense that Zionism was a rebellion against the passive course of Jewish history. Right, Jacob had taken a turn to the extreme, right? This quietistic way of engaging the world to the point where we weren't even actors on the stage of world history. And what did Zionism want to do? Zionism wanted to create a new Jew. Zionism wanted to glorify brute strength, right? And so the pendulum swings in completely the opposite direction, right? To the point where we have a state that acts in a very knee-jerk sort of way, right? The return to be kachol hagoyim, to be like all of the nations of the world, right, was a return to a place in which we need to use power, right? And most of the time that has worked for the Jewish people, but there are times when, right, it puts us at a disadvantage. And, it's part of the contemporary conversation that is going on in Israel. What is the place of power? How do we use power? How do we use power constructively? Obviously, this is a very, very relevant and pertinent topic as we approach Hanukkah. Arvin, jump in.
Just two comments before the session's over. One, to echo Joel, and just a sneak preview of what Shelley's going to send you, Matt. The conclusion I reach is Jacob's problem is what will the goyim think? So that's and I think that the go along to get along is his motif. That's his personality. We see that he does whatever Mama says, he does whatever this one says. He doesn't want confrontation as much. Secondly, in terms of Rabbi Cook, last August, you delivered a class on Avram Cook. And I went back because I was interested in reading these quotes today. But in that class, you mentioned that Cook had his detractors from the Orthodox world. But unfortunately, I didn't find any material on it or in the class when I went back to read it. If you have anything, because I'm now interested in this father-son dynamic, could you share that with us if you have some materials about what the criticism was of Cook by the Orthodox and the Haredi group?
Yes, I'm going to recommend a book to you, Arvin. It is just about the most fabulous biography that has ever been written, no exaggeration. It's Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook by Yehuda Mirsky. It is a fabulous, fabulous book, and he writes about this extensively. He brings the entire character, the fullness of the personality of Rav Cook alive in such wonderful ways. And he talks a lot about the critique that was coming from certain corners of the religious world on Rav Cook. Because remember Rav Cook was very much about an embrace of secular Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to he saw them as embodying Kedusha, right? Just like he, as an ultra-Orthodox Jew, embodied holiness, he saw those secular Israelis embodying holiness. And this was very, very disturbing to his other Haredi colleagues. Yes, the attacks were vicious on Rav Cook, and Yehuda Mirsky talks about this pretty extensively.
Did his son defend him?
Tzvi Yehuda?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, after his death, he defended him. But yeah, take a look there. And, the other thing that I could do is next week, I could scan some of the pages for you, Arvin. So just remind me. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have come to the finish line. I want to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for tuning in. Great having you on. Very, very happy. I was a little concerned at the beginning of this session. Delighted that the Beit Midrash filled up in the end. So great having you all. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom. And I also want to wish you a very, very happy Thanksgiving going into next week. So enjoy the turkey prep. And I'm reminding myself that Nadia, we have to order a turkey from Super Deal. So I got to make a pit stop there and get that order. Yes. All the best. Take care. Be well.
Be well.
Shabbat Shalom. Purim Sameach. I'm probably not going to see you before Hanukkah begins. So very, very happy Hanukkah. Take care.